Hello, this is KSQD 90.7 Weekly Cutting Edge. I'm your host, Galina Hale, Professor of Economics at UCSC and a Faculty Director at the Institute for Social Transformation. My guest today is my colleague, Peter Christensen, who is also a professor in the Economics Department at UCSC. But he's also a research associate at National Bureau of Economic Research and a faculty affiliate at the Poverty Action Laboratory, known as JPAL, where he serves as a scientific advisor to the Evidence for Climate Action Project. He works on how public policy and technological interventions can be used to improve social and environmental outcomes in the cities all around the world. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you so much for having me today.
So, Peter, you have amazing credentials. You're clearly doing a lot of work. Maybe we can start by you telling us a little bit more about what is your research focus and maybe what motivates it for you personally.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am an environmental and public economist, and I really focus on the types of public policies and interventions that can make changes in reducing environmental externalities around the world. So basically what that means is improving the both natural and physical outcomes for humans in our natural environments. And my work really focuses on two main threads. One is environmental inequality, particularly in cities. I'm interested in understanding what are the causes and consequences of, for example, discrimination, racial discrimination or other forms of discrimination on differential pollution exposures, or differential environmentally based or driven inequalities. And then the other main thread of research that I'm working on is what are the policies and programs that can most cost effectively reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. So we're getting lots of information from the engineering community, from the scientific community regarding potential pathways to dramatically reduce emissions in the atmosphere by mid-century or by the end of century. But of course, we need to understand what the cost of those different emissions reduction strategies are, how they will interact with economic development around the world, and what the potential is for cost-effective action and what we describe in economics as the distributional impacts of those types of policies. That is, how will they potentially impact and create benefits for different communities and populations along the income distribution, poor people versus wealthier people around the world.
So I'm super interested in this topic, as you know, and I've been mostly focusing on the climate justice when it comes to the adaptation. And we can talk a little bit about that later if you want. But
Sure.
From the mitigation point of view, I frequently hear, well, we can't have a gasoline tax because it's effectively regressive, because gasoline expenses is a larger share of low-income budgets than it is of the high-income budgets. And so that's frequently like a political argument, which, you know, has some value, I think. So what can you say about that? Like, how do we get around, or what are the policy instruments that don't have that problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it absolutely is at the crux of the climate justice debate, because there are many instances of policies and programs that might reduce, cost effectively, cheaply, reduce emissions in the atmosphere, but they may do it in a way that is distributionally regressive. That is, that either disproportionately harms poor people or low-income communities within the US or around the world, or disproportionately benefits wealthier communities around the world. So examples of this include gasoline taxes or a carbon tax in general. Also, programs and policies such as photovoltaic subsidies, subsidies for electric vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. And it is absolutely critical. There are reasons to believe that theoretical reasons to believe that these policies will be or could be distributionally regressive. And I guess one of the things that we're doing as part of the evidence for climate action work that I'm sure we'll discuss later in the program is bringing empirical frameworks to these questions so that we can understand precisely how these different programs impact different subpopulations of people, both in the United States and elsewhere around the world. So that's part of the answer to the question. We think we know, but we don't know exactly, and we need a lot more information. The second part of the question with respect to taxes in particular is that, or actually more generally, is that it often depends on the way that these policies or programs are designed. So, for example, in the case of a gasoline tax or a tax on certain types of energy used in homes, whether that's electricity or heating fuel, et cetera. It depends on the way that the tax is designed and the way that the revenue is reinvested into the economy. So there are certain designs of policies that are distributionally neutral or distributionally progressive, and this depends on design questions. And that's true also for subsidy instruments like the ones that we saw proposed and implemented through the Inflation Reduction Act. It often really depends on how we structure the policy or program. And we can structure policies in ways that achieve both cost-effective reductions as well as distributionally neutral or progressive reductions. And sometimes there are trade-offs between these, but it's precisely through the types of empirical research that we're able to do in the economics community and more generally in multidisciplinary research that give us the exact information that we need. So one point that I'll sort of come back to again and again here is that this community of researchers that is involved in environmental economics and more generally is really focused on using rigorous empirical tools to provide answers to these questions, to give us the specific information about the impacts of policies that we might design. And right now, around the world, we're running many experiments effectively. Different types of policy instruments are being implemented with different types of designs in different countries, counties, states, and cities or provinces. And we need to understand how they interact with economic development on the ground, as well as with other policies and conditions in order to build the science of decarbonization for the 21st century.
All right. Wow. So let's talk a little bit more about that, because you mentioned that you're leading the Evidence for Climate Action project for the Poverty Action Lab. So maybe you can first tell our listeners what the Poverty Action Lab is. And in particular, can you also explain a little bit how the coverage of research in terms of focusing on low-income countries versus focusing on low-income communities in wealthy countries, how is that balanced around? And then we'll talk specifically about the Climate Action Project.
Sure. So the basis of the idea here is that over the last 50 years or so, we have developed a very sophisticated, multidisciplinary science of climate change. And economics has been a part of this, but of course, almost every field has been a part of developing this science. I would say that over the last, we could quibble on exactly what the span of time is, but over the past approximately 2 decades, we have developed a very sophisticated science of decarbonization projections. And what that means is we're asking the question, or scientists and engineers are out there asking the question, what types of technologies and what are our pathways to reducing dramatic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions concentrations in the atmosphere by mid-century or by end of century. What we haven't had, and what we're developing now, I would say over the last 5 to 10, just in the last 5 to 10 years, and hopefully will scale in the next 5 to 10 years, is the other piece of that science of decarbonization, which is we have ex ante projections that tell us what types of policies and programs we might invest in, but we don't have ex post impact evaluations that give us information about the specific impacts of those policies once they're implemented. And this is really critical for 3 reasons. One, our projections involve an incredibly sophisticated set of scientific models, and each of which involves huge assumptions. Mm-hmm. Those assumptions are impossible in the absence of actually implementing the policies and programs that the projections support to evaluate. And so we won't know whether we might assume that we're getting 100% of the emissions reductions that are projected through a major decarbonization policy, a program, but we won't know until we actually evaluate it. And we have the tools of rigorous evaluation that include experimental work that's sort of the basis of the Poverty Action Lab's work around the world. And also other methods that have emerged basically in the last 2 decades that allow us to build this other half of the science of decarbonization, which is impact evaluation. That impact evaluation is structured to do 2 things. One, tell us which types of policies or programs can most cost effectively and efficaciously reduce emissions in the atmosphere. And 2, what are their distributional impacts, as we were just discussing? Who do they benefit? Do they benefit the wealthiest in the US and around the world, or do they disproportionately benefit low-income communities around the world? We know from research that has been over a decade of mounting research that the reduction of a ton of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere will disproportionately benefit poor populations, impoverished populations around the world. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the manner in which we achieve those emissions reductions disproportionately benefits low-income communities. So that's the subject of empirical research.
Okay, so can I clarify a little bit? So I think
sure.
in empirical economic research, right? So a more traditional approach is to look at just policies that have happened, right? And use that data as kind of a quasi-natural experiment and run statistical evaluation of trying to do a causal inference from that. And in the climate change space, that has been very difficult because we only had minimal policies so far implemented, nowhere near of what we need to get to the Paris goals, or we're kind of blowing past those already. But so what you are talking about is something different, right? Is to actually create experiments that will generate the data that we can then extrapolate for more global policies that are needed?
That's right. So what we're advocating in its most basic form is rigorous impact evaluation that can include observational research or experimental research. But the Climate Action Learning Lab that I'm currently leading is focused on experimental research, which many in our field and in general consider to be the gold standard in impact evaluation. It gives us the most precise answer with the fewest assumptions possible. It also has a couple of other additional advantages. So the effort that we are building to develop this experimental coordinated research effort to develop experiments that can effectively evaluate decarbonization programs involves building partnerships between policymakers that are implementing the programs and research teams that are capable of evaluating them. The idea here is not only to study the policies, but also to create an interchange and partnership between public policymakers who are making decisions not only about which types of programs to develop, but about their design that can benefit from interaction with the scientific community, including economists. We have a lot to say about how certain types of programs and policies, subsidy instruments versus tax instruments, et cetera, might affect different types of people, different populations, how it might affect the private sector, economic growth, et cetera. And so it can be very important to have that interchange develop as a policy or program is being designed and implemented. But then we structure an experiment to evaluate it in ways that allow us to test different design ideas that policymakers view as potentially important. And that means that we learn. And we learn as scientists, the policymakers learn and potentially refine the design of those programs to achieve their goals, more effectively achieve their goals. Because many times, as I say, we're developing as a society many different thousands of different experiments in how to reduce emissions in the atmosphere. So many of those are going to work in slightly different or very different ways than we thought that they would. And so by developing this close connection and partnership with the policymakers that are implementing them, scientists can have greater impact in terms of how policies are designed, how they're scaled, et cetera. And so this kind of partnership we view as very, very important, not only scientifically, but also in terms of diffusing the research, disseminating the research that we develop, and also framing our questions.
Yeah, so I think you hit on something very important, and I want to praise here the California government that has been reaching proactively to the research community, right? We have the climate action grants that the UC system has received from the state of California. Our Institute for Social Transformation is now on a second contract with the California Air Resource Board. The first one was specifically focusing on the distributional aspects of their policies, and the new one is more on evaluating their quantitative models. So they're actually reaching out. They understand that they have so much work to do, and why not draw on the amazing human capital that the UC system at least and research community more generally. So in your work, how does it generally work? Do you try to reach out to the governments and say, hey, let's have this pilot project? Or are you getting requests from the government saying, hey, we want to do that, but we need some help evaluating the impact? What is the practical work of creating those relationships?
So it happens in both ways, in both directions. The impetus for this entire effort was really that JPAL, the organization through which this is being developed, was receiving requests when the Inflation Reduction Act was being developed, which required governments, city and state grantees, et cetera, to evaluate the impact of their programs. And the leading edge of those agencies was interested in doing that in the most rigorous way possible and recognized that they didn't necessarily have the capacity in-house or sometimes the resources to be able to provide the best available science. And so they were reaching out to JPAL to see who could help provide research support for these evaluations. And JPAL realized we're not coordinated. We don't have the coordinated network that would be needed to develop the scale of research that is really needed to both evaluate the programs and then synthesize the results so that we can actually build an effective science of decarbonization. So that was the impetus. It was very much from receiving a bunch of requests and not necessarily being able to field all of those requests because the coordination was needed within the research community. Now we're developing that coordinated network. We have dozens of research teams that are available and responding to those requests when they come in from government potential partners. JPAL as an organization has also received significant financial support for this, and as a result is going to state and local governments that have received funding or through for the federal government or state governments or otherwise are standing up and implementing really interesting decarbonization policies where there is the potential to develop an experimental approach. And so in some cases, JPAL is also coordinating government agencies that are curious about the use of these methods, maybe aware of these methods, but don't have the training or the understanding to be able to have reached out to the organization to begin with. So it's happening in both directions, and it's beginning to grow at a scale that's getting really exciting.
And so is that work limited to the US or is it global? I know the title is North America, so.
Yeah, that's right. So it started in North America. So JPAL is broken into regional offices, and the JPAL North America office, for the reasons that I just described, primarily in response to the development of the Inflation Reduction Act and interest in doing evaluation, is where this began. But now there's interest in Europe. There's interest in basically every major region that JPAL serves. And so the question is the model transferable to these other regions and regional offices? Can we do the same in other places? The answer so far appears to be yes, and it's just a matter of what is the most efficient way to scale the project. But the interest is certainly there, and decarbonization policies are not only, and investments in decarbonization are not only being made in very large scale in the US through the Inflation Reduction Act and in Europe, but also in countries and regions around the world. So this is, in the next 5 to 10 years, we believe going to get very, very interesting and achieve a scale that creates a science that is very actionable.
Yeah, and I think as you said, in last 5 to 10 years, there's also more attention to this in climate negotiations and policy discussions because, okay, one simple solution to reducing carbon in the atmosphere is to plant more trees.
Right.
Let's just plant more trees. Well, an economist then will ask, well, on whose land? Right? So how do we make sure that we don't say, oh, we're going to plant it on the cheapest land, which tends to be, well, that's where the lowest income people live. Right. And so I think this kind of questions is now, I'm not in Brazil right now. I'm not in the rooms when negotiations are happening, but I know from talking to people who are in those rooms that the rights of indigenous communities, the rights of lower income communities are absolutely a topic of conversation now. And that's probably why the governments are coming to you for
Of
help in
course.
figuring this. I think, I frequently refer to that as unintended consequences of policies is
Right.
what economics is really all about.
We would like to prevent unintended consequences, but when they happen, we certainly need to understand that they are happening and why they are happening so that we can refine the programs in the ways that we need. Absolutely. And this is happening in part because the decarbonization strategy that's being developed in a very piecemeal way around the world is happening so quickly. And of course, it interacts with all kinds of other types of policies, programs, as well as just development contexts on the ground. And so this kind of research is needed more than ever so that we avoid making enormous investments that have enormous unintended consequences.
Right. And I remember there was this kind of a table made by, I think, the World Bank, where they looked at the Sustainable Development Goals, of which climate change is number 13, but the first one is reduction of poverty, and the second one is reduction of global hunger. And they put like the lights when when the goals are complementary, it would be green, but when the goals could be at odds, it would be red. And in a lot of cases, sustainable development goals are at odds with the climate change because of all these reasons
they can be
mentioned.
And I would say that this is really about going past green and red. We need to know to what extent, and are there ways of addressing those trade-offs. In some cases, there are simple ways of addressing them. In other cases, there are not. And that's where the rubber hits the road in decarbonization policy. And those are the types of trade-offs and political battles that we're going to see playing out over the coming decades. And we need to, just as California is a very good example of this right now, we need to do that in the context of independently developed, scientifically rigorous information. These can't be battles that play out on the basis of assumptions about who's being harmed or hurt. We actually have to have the information in order to make good decisions on the timeline that we need.
This is a perfect sentiment to end. Unfortunately, we're out of time.
Oh, wow, that went fast.
It's amazing.
This is so fun.
These issues are so complicated. We could discuss them for hours, but we only have a very limited amount of time. So maybe we can have you back in a year or so, and you can tell us some of the amazing main findings you have.
Absolutely. That would be great. Thanks so much for having me today.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was Peter Christensen, who is a professor of economics at UCSC. And this was Cutting Edge at KSQD 90.7. I'm Galina Hale. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.